The plane was filled with an unusual silence, the kind that doesn't come naturally on a flight packed with people. Normally, there would be chatter, the soft hum of conversations blending with the whirring of the engines. But here, fear had replaced sound. Passengers sat stiff in their seats, their hands trembling, their eyes avoiding the armed men who paced the aisle with threatening glares. The hijackers had taken control so suddenly that most barely had time to process what was happening. Their voices were sharp, commanding, filled with an authority that came from the cold confidence of men who held weapons. Each word they spoke reminded everyone of the reality. Their lives were hanging by a fragile thread. In the middle of all this, she sat quietly, blending in as though she were no different from the others. She didn't flinch when the men barked orders or shoved their rifles against the backs of chairs. She didn't tremble when a child whimpered nearby or when one of the hijackers slammed the butt of his weapon into the armrest of a terrified passenger to silence them. Instead, she kept her face calm, her body relaxed, her hands folded neatly on her lap. To anyone looking, she seemed like just another frightened woman trying to survive. But beneath that stillness was a trained mind, one that was calculating every movement, every breath, every weakness in the enemy's stance. The air inside the plane felt heavy, every second stretched into an eternity as the hijackers asserted their dominance. They moved methodically, their eyes scanning for anyone who looked strong enough to resist or foolish enough to defy them. Most passengers looked down at their feet or stared blankly at the seat ahead, unwilling to make eye contact and risk drawing attention. She kept her gaze low as well, but she noticed everything. Their positions, their rotations, the weight distribution of the weapons, even the smallest tremor in the hands of one who wasn't as confident as he wanted the others to believe. When one of the hijackers ordered her to stand, she obeyed instantly, her movements precise but unthreatening. He shoved a tray into her hands and barked at her to pour coffee for the passengers. To them, it was a cruel game, a humiliation to make her serve while they watched. To her, it was a cover, a chance to move through the cabin unnoticed, to study angles and assess proximity. The tray rattled slightly in her grip, not from fear but from the turbulence of the plane, though anyone watching might have thought it was nervousness. She allowed that perception to remain, because the more they underestimated her, the greater her advantage would be when the time came. As she walked down the aisle, she could feel the eyes of the passengers on her. Some pitied her, some were too afraid to look for long, and some silently begged her not to provoke the hijackers further. She offered each of them a reassuring look, subtle enough that the armed men wouldn't notice, but steady enough that it gave those nearest to her a fleeting spark of hope. In situations like these, even the smallest gesture mattered. Her every step was a balance between obedience and quiet defiance, between seeming harmless and preparing to strike when the moment was right. The hijackers laughed amongst themselves, mocking her servitude as though she were beneath them. They saw only a woman complying with their orders, nothing more. They didn't notice the way her eyes flicked briefly to the emergency exit, or how she marked the distance between them and the cockpit door. They didn't know that behind her composed exterior was a mind that had been sharpened by years of training, discipline, and missions that demanded perfection under pressure. The tension in the cabin grew thicker with each passing minute. The passengers' fear was palpable, their breath shallow, their bodies frozen in anticipation of what might come next. The hijackers thrived on this atmosphere, feeding on control, but they couldn't sense the storm quietly brewing within the very woman they thought they had reduced to a servant. She poured coffee, row by row, her hands steady, her eyes sharp, her every motion a deliberate act of patience in a game they didn't even realize she was playing. She moved carefully through the narrow aisle, balancing the tray as though this was nothing more than the role they had forced her into. To anyone watching, she was just another passenger coerced into obedience, going along to keep the hijackers calm and avoid drawing their wrath. The men barked at her, their voices harsh, reminding her and everyone else who was in control. But inside her, there was no fear, only focus. Her calm demeanor was not the act of a helpless woman. It was the discipline of someone who had been trained to stay composed when everything around her was collapsing into chaos. Her every step was measured, her expression carefully crafted. She kept her shoulders slightly slouched, her eyes downcast, projecting the appearance of submission. Yet she was absorbing every detail in her surroundings. She counted the number of weapons, the way they were being held, the distance between the hijackers and the passengers. She noticed which ones moved with confidence and which ones were pretending, covering their nervousness with loud threats. She saw the way one of them had to keep adjusting the strap of his rifle, how another had a slight limp in his left leg. To anyone else, these would have been insignificant details, but to her they were pieces of a puzzle that she was slowly assembling. The act of pouring coffee became her disguise. It allowed her to move freely where no one else could, to get close to the hijackers without raising suspicion. Each time she leaned forward to hand a cup to a passenger, she positioned herself in such a way that she could study the hijackers' blind spots, the angle of their weapons, and the rhythm of their patrols down the aisle. What looked like obedience was actually reconnaissance. She used every moment to build a map in her head, preparing for when the opportunity to act would arrive. Passengers watched her with a mix of pity and fear. Some thought she was breaking under the pressure, humiliated into playing the role of a server. Others silently prayed that her compliance would keep the hijackers calm, that she wouldn't do anything to provoke them. They couldn't know that beneath her calm exterior was a mind already working 3 steps ahead. She didn't need them to understand. What she needed was for them to stay quiet, to stay alive, until the time came when silence would give way to action. The hijackers, arrogant in their sense of power, didn't see through her mask. They chuckled as she moved, tossing crude remarks, as if forcing her to pour coffee proved their superiority. They didn't realize she was observing them more closely than they were watching her. They thought the tremor in her hands was fear, but it was nothing more than the vibration of the plane against the tray. They thought her lowered eyes meant submission, but in reality, they allowed her to see more without ever seeming defiant. Every assumption they made about her worked in her favor. She kept her breathing slow and steady, using the same techniques she had practiced countless times before. Her training had prepared her for moments just like this. Moments when composure could mean survival, when patience could be the difference between failure and success. While the passengers drowned in fear, she drew strength from it, knowing that the calm she projected could serve as a thin thread of hope for those who caught even a glimpse of her steadiness. Her disguise as a passive bystander extended beyond her actions. Even in the way she spoke, polite, quiet, deferential, she gave the impression that she was broken into compliance. But beneath that layer of calm obedience, her mind remained sharp, her instincts heightened. Every sound was amplified to her ears, the clicking of a weapon being shifted, the uneven rhythm of a boot against the floor, the sharp inhale of a hijacker trying to mask his nerves. She cataloged everything, building a mental record she would later rely on when the time came to strike. The passengers may have seen her as helpless, but her stillness was anything but weakness. It was control. It was strategy. It was the art of hiding strength in plain sight. By letting the hijackers believe they had stripped her of dignity, she was quietly tightening the noose around their false sense of security. Her calm demeanor, her careful obedience, her willingness to play their game. It was all part of something larger, something far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. The cabin air seemed to grow heavier with every second that passed, pressing down on everyone trapped inside. Fear had spread like wildfire among the passengers, and it showed in the smallest of details. The clenched fists gripping armrests, the rapid rise and fall of chests trying to breathe quietly, the way some closed their eyes as if shutting out the sight of the hijackers could somehow erase the danger. Whispers had long vanished, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the sharp voices of the armed men pacing the aisle. Every passenger knew that even the slightest movement could trigger a violent reaction, and so they froze, trapped between terror and helplessness. Children clung to their parents, muffling their sobs in shirts and arms, while parents whispered reassurances they didn't believe themselves. Couples held each other's hands tightly, not daring to speak, but sharing silent vows of protection. Some passengers stared straight ahead, eyes unfocused, as though their minds had left their bodies in an attempt to escape the nightmare. Others trembled openly, unable to mask their fear. The hijackers thrived on this atmosphere, their voices louder, their orders harsher, feeding on the control they believed was absolute. Every small command they barked reminded the passengers of who held the power. Sit still. Stay quiet. Don't look at us. Their authority came not just from the weapons they carried, but from the psychological grip of fear that kept everyone compliant. It was more than a hijacking. It was domination of both body and spirit. And in that moment, fear became the unifying language of the cabin, understood by all without a word needing to be spoken. Some passengers dared to sneak glances at the hijackers, their eyes darting quickly before returning to the safety of the floor. They noted the scars, the hardened expressions, the way the men's fingers never strayed far from the triggers. Others didn't dare look at all, instead staring at their shoes or the seat in front of them, hoping that invisibility might shield them. For many, the worst fear wasn't the hijackers themselves, but the unknown, the uncertainty of whether they would survive the flight or if their lives were already counted in the men's plans. Amidst the silence, every sound became magnified. The shuffle of boots on the floor, the metallic click of a gun being adjusted, the forced cries of a child. Each one pierced the tension like thunder. The passengers' nerves were so frayed that even the faintest creak of the overhead bins seemed loud enough to startle. With nowhere to run and no control over their fate, the fear transformed into a suffocating weight, pressing down harder with every passing moment. The hijackers, reveling in their dominance, carried themselves with an air of invincibility. Their eyes scanned the rows for signs of resistance, but what they saw only confirmed what they already believed, that the passengers were broken, subdued, and incapable of fighting back. They mistook silence for weakness, trembling for surrender, and submission for defeat. This illusion fed their arrogance, making them careless in ways they couldn't yet see. For the passengers, however, fear was not just a reaction, it was a prison. Every instinct told them to stay still, to survive by blending into the background. No one dared to rise or speak out, because the image of what could happen, the barrel of a rifle pressed to a head, the cold finality of a trigger pull, was too vivid. Their fear became a chain that locked them to their seats, ensuring that not a single one of them thought resistance was even possible. As minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the hopelessness deepened. For many, this seemed like the end of their stories, written not by their own choices, but by the hands of men who held their lives at gunpoint. Some prayed quietly, lips moving in silence. Others stared blankly, lost in thoughts of loved ones they feared they'd never see again. The terror was not just about dying. It was about dying powerless, without a chance to fight back. In this atmosphere, courage seemed unimaginable. The cabin was drowning in dread, the kind of fear that strips people of their voice and leaves only submission in its place. Every glance, every shallow breath, every trembling hand painted a picture of human fragility in the face of violence. And yet, within that suffocating silence, there was one passenger who was not crushed by fear but fueled by it. One who saw the same hijackers but through very different eyes, measuring them not as invincible predators, but as men who had unknowingly placed themselves within reach of someone trained for moments exactly like this. While fear had consumed almost every passenger on the plane, there was one woman who stood apart, not through outward defiance, but through an inner calm that seemed unshakable. She did not tremble, did not fidget, did not allow her breath to come in shallow bursts like the others around her. Instead, she sat with a quiet steadiness, her movements measured, her expression neutral. To the hijackers, she looked like just another passenger obeying orders, but inside her mind, she was working tirelessly, analyzing, calculating, and preparing. Where others saw only chaos, she saw patterns. Where others saw danger, she saw opportunities hidden within the danger itself. As the hijackers strutted through the cabin, barking orders and flaunting their weapons, she observed them with a trained eye. Every detail mattered. The way one gripped his weapon too tightly, the slight tremor in another's stance, the way they communicated with hand signals rather than words. She studied their behavior with the same focus she had once used during countless training exercises, because she knew that in a crisis, small details often made the biggest difference. Her calm demeanor was not accidental. It was the result of years of discipline, years of learning to quiet fear and replace it with strategy. The passengers around her didn't notice the sharpness in her gaze, hidden as it was behind lowered eyelids and a mask of compliance. They thought she was just enduring like them, waiting for the nightmare to end. But what they couldn't see was the way her mind was mapping the cabin, calculating distances, exits, and possible outcomes. Her stillness wasn't weakness, it was control. She was conserving energy, waiting for the right moment, knowing that in situations like this, timing was everything. When she was forced to move through the cabin, pouring coffee at the hijacker's command, her composure remained intact. Her steps were slow, careful, exactly what they expected of someone terrified into obedience. But beneath the surface, every movement had purpose. She studied which hijacker kept his weapon at the ready, which one let it lower when he thought no one was watching. She marked who lingered near the cockpit and who stayed near the passengers. She counted the seconds it took for them to patrol from the front to the back, learning their rhythm as though it were a rehearsed dance. Her calm demeanor also had another effect, one she carefully nurtured. It was a balm to those nearest her. A mother with 2 children in the row beside her caught her eye at one point, and in that brief exchange, the woman gave the faintest nod, a silent signal of reassurance. The mother's shoulders relaxed ever so slightly, and her grip on her children loosened just enough to let them breathe easier. Though she didn't speak, her calm presence was contagious in small, quiet ways, offering hope where there seemed to be none. Even the colonel seated a few rows away noticed her composure. His eyes lingered on her as she passed, his trained instincts recognizing something familiar in the way she carried herself. He was too disciplined to draw attention, but he filed it away in his mind, watching her closely, waiting to see what would unfold. It was in that moment of silent recognition that the seeds of an unspoken alliance were planted, one that could mean the difference between survival and tragedy. The hijackers, however, saw none of this. To them, she was background noise, a pawn they controlled, a servant they mocked. They took her calmness as fear, her obedience as surrender. They had no idea that the very thing they dismissed was the thing that would one day undo them. Her ability to remain composed under pressure kept her invisible to them, and invisibility was her greatest weapon. While they enjoyed the illusion of dominance, she quietly dismantled it piece by piece in her mind, storing information that would become crucial when the time came. Every hijacker wanted the passengers broken, to see only desperation in their eyes, but when they glanced her way, they never suspected the strength she held in reserve. Her calm was her armor, shielding her true identity, her true purpose. It allowed her to mask her intent so perfectly that not even the sharpest of the hijackers thought to question her. She wasn't just calm for herself. She was calm for everyone, for the plane, for the mission she knew she would soon be forced to undertake. And as the minutes stretched on, her unshaken composure became not just a disguise, but the quiet foundation on which everything that followed would depend. The shift began so subtly that most passengers didn't notice it at first. To them, the woman was still just following orders, walking the aisle with the tray, doing what the hijackers demanded of her. But under the surface, something had changed. Her movements, though still careful, carried a new precision. The way she glanced around the cabin was no longer simply observation, it was calculation. Every step she took was part of a plan quietly taking shape. And while the hijackers believed they had broken her into submission, in truth, she was beginning to reclaim control, inch by inch, second by second. The colonel, sitting a few rows back, was the first to sense it. His eyes had caught the faint glimmer of the Navy SEAL ring on her finger earlier, and with that knowledge, her every movement now took on a different meaning to him. Where others saw only a frightened woman, he saw strategy. Where others saw obedience, he recognized discipline. Without speaking a word, he began to sync his awareness with hers, silently acknowledging that she was not who she appeared to be. Between them, an unspoken trust began to form, a silent alliance in the middle of chaos. She timed her actions carefully. When she bent to place a cup on a tray table, she lingered just a second longer, enough to glance at the placement of a hijacker's boots. When she straightened, her eyes flicked toward the cockpit door, noting how firmly it was shut and who was standing guard. She even adjusted the tray once or twice in her hands, pretending to struggle with the weight, all while repositioning herself closer to key areas of the cabin. To the hijackers, these were meaningless movements. To her, they were preparation. The passengers remained unaware of the transformation happening before their eyes. They were too lost in their own fear to see the subtle change in her demeanor. But those who looked closely enough, those seated directly near her, could feel something different in the way she carried herself. A man in the aisle seat whispered a prayer as she passed, and though she didn't reply, the calm steadiness in her eyes gave him a fleeting spark of courage. A mother tightened her grip on her child, then loosened it slightly when she noticed the woman's composure hadn't wavered. The smallest signs of resilience were beginning to ripple outward, though no one could quite understand why. Her shift from passive obedience to quiet resistance was not reckless, it was deliberate. She knew that one wrong move could cost not only her life, but the lives of everyone on board. But she also knew that passivity was not an option forever. The hijackers' arrogance was a weakness, and they had already underestimated her. That arrogance would grow, and when it reached its peak, it would give her the sliver of opportunity she needed. She wasn't waiting for the chance to fight out of impulse. She was preparing for the precise moment when action would mean survival. The colonel's recognition of her role added another layer of strength. Though they hadn't spoken, though they couldn't risk even the faintest whisper, the knowledge in his eyes told her that she wasn't alone. It was a silent confirmation that when the time came, he would be ready, that he trusted her instincts as much as his own. That unspoken connection became a lifeline, an invisible thread tying them together against the hijackers who still believed they were untouchable. Even the way she served the hijackers began to change. She still obeyed, still played the part they had forced upon her, but with each interaction, she was studying their habits more closely. When one of them demanded water, she noted how his rifle slipped slightly against his shoulder. When another leaned back to stretch, she observed the way his balance shifted to one leg. Every encounter became a lesson in their weaknesses, every second of forced servitude another chance to prepare for what was coming. The careful timing of her shift was what made it so powerful. The hijackers remained convinced of their dominance, convinced that the passengers were too afraid to move, convinced that the woman serving them was nothing more than a pawn. But while they clung to that illusion, she was dismantling it silently, without drawing attention. Her mask of obedience gave her cover, and under that cover, she was building momentum toward the inevitable. What no one else on the plane could see was that the turning point was already in motion. The balance of control was beginning to tilt, not because the hijackers had lost their weapons or their authority, but because one woman had decided to shift from passive survival to active resistance. Her silence, her composure, her willingness to play along, they had all been part of her plan. And now, as her disguise slowly gave way to her true strength, the course of the flight itself was quietly beginning to change. The cabin had reached a breaking point, the kind of silence that comes before an inevitable storm. The hijackers still strutted down the aisle with their weapons, still barked commands as though their power was absolute. But the illusion of their dominance was already beginning to fracture. The woman who had played the role of servant was no longer merely observing. She was preparing. Beneath the surface of her steady demeanor, the years of training, discipline, and instinct were aligning into a single purpose. She knew the risks, knew that any mistake could end in catastrophe, but hesitation was not in her nature. She had been forged for moments exactly like this. The colonel's earlier glance at her ring had sealed something unspoken between them. While no words were exchanged, the recognition in his eyes told her that he understood, that he was ready to move when she moved. The passengers remained unaware of this silent alliance, their fears still holding them captive, but the tide was already shifting. She had mapped the plane in her mind, memorized the positions of the hijackers, and timed their movements with precision. The moment for action was drawing closer, and with it came the responsibility she had carried all her life, to protect those who could not protect themselves. Her composure remained intact, even as her pulse quickened with the anticipation of what was to come. Every fiber of her being was tuned to the rhythm of the cabin, the shuffle of boots, the distant murmur of terrified whispers, the mechanical hum of the engines. To anyone else, these sounds were background noise. To her, they were cues, signals that marked the timing of her next step. She had learned long ago that victory in moments like these was not about brute force, but about precision, about striking at the exact second when the enemy least expected it. The hijackers continued to mock her, still convinced of her obedience, still blind to the storm gathering beneath the surface. They had mistaken her patience for fear, her silence for surrender. It was the same mistake others had made before, the same arrogance that had always been the undoing of those who underestimated her. Each sneer, each order barked in her direction only solidified her resolve, sharpening her focus until there was no room left for doubt. Around her, the passengers sat frozen, unaware of how close they were to the moment that would change everything. Some still prayed quietly, others clung to loved ones, their bodies trembling with the weight of their fear. None of them could see the shift that had already begun, the invisible current that was slowly gathering strength. To them, she was still just another woman forced into compliance. They could not yet grasp that she carried the training and resolve of a Navy SEAL, hidden beneath the disguise of submission. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness, but to her, time had taken on a different quality. She could feel the build-up of momentum, the narrowing of possibilities, the way every path she had calculated was converging toward one outcome. Her breathing stayed steady, her muscles relaxed but ready, her mind as sharp as the edge of a blade. She knew there would be chaos once she acted, knew that fear would explode into panic, but that was a risk she had accepted long ago. What mattered was that the hijackers would lose their grip, that their illusion of control would shatter in an instant. The colonel shifted slightly in his seat, a nearly imperceptible movement, but one she caught immediately. It was a signal, not deliberate, but instinctive, an acknowledgement that he was with her, that when the first move came, he would not hesitate to follow. Their silent bond gave her the reinforcement she needed. She was not just one against many. She was part of something larger, something stronger than fear. Her disguise had served its purpose. The mask of obedience had bought her time, had lulled the hijackers into complacency, and now the moment to cast it aside was nearly at hand. The passengers might not have seen it, but she knew that every detail she had gathered, every observation she had stored, had brought her to this point. The cabin was still cloaked in fear, but within her burned something far greater, an unyielding resolve, a courage honed by years of service, and the knowledge that she carried the skills to turn the tide in an instant. The fate of the plane, the lives of every soul on board, now rested on her ability to act when the time was right. And as the hijackers continued their charade of dominance, blind to the storm waiting in their midst, she readied herself for the moment when silence would end and her true identity would no longer remain hidden.